They made the world laugh in 140 countries for 20 years. But behind the chases and the saxophone, the show's biggest star died alone in an armchair in front of his television and wasn't found for 2 days. And one of his dancing girls walked off that set and quietly became one of the most loved sitcom stars in American history. 57 years later, this is where all of them ended up. Number 1 is Jane Leeves, the answer to a trivia question millions of Americans have never been told. They watched her play Daphne Moon on Frasier for 11 seasons. What none of them knew was where she'd come from. Leeves was 22 when she first appeared on The Benny Hill Show in 1983, a dancer in a feathered costume, and she has admitted in every interview since that it is not the credit she likes to lead with. Here is the secret she has spent her whole career outrunning. Jane Leeves had never wanted to dance for Benny Hill. Born Jane Elizabeth Leeves on April 18, 1961, in Ilford, England, she had trained from childhood at the Bush Davies School of Dance, dreaming only of being a ballerina. At 18, an ankle injury so severe it ended her ballet career changed everything. The dream was done. The Benny Hill audition was rent money. And then she did the bravest thing of her life. She packed up and moved to Los Angeles, alone, with no contacts and no job waiting. The years that followed were small parts until 1993, when she walked into an audition for a new sitcom called Frasier and was cast as Daphne Moon. 11 seasons. An Emmy nomination. The highest-paid British actress in Hollywood at her peak. She married CBS executive Marshall Coben in 1996. As of today, Jane Leeves is 65 and still working. The girl on Benny Hill's stage was a thwarted ballerina chasing rent. Jane Leeves turned a broken ankle and a sketch comedy paycheck into Daphne Moon and walked off that set never imagining the world would one day know her face under a different name. Number 2 is Jackie Wright, the tiny bald Irishman whose head Benny slapped in some of the most quoted moments in comedy history. Watch any compilation and you will see it. The bald pate, the rapid pat-pat-pat of Benny's hand, the sped-up film, the saxophone. It is one of the most recognized comedy images of the 20th century. And the reason for the slap is something nobody in the audience ever guessed. Here is the secret behind the joke. Jackie Wright was a chain smoker. On a set where lit cigarettes were forbidden between takes, he developed the habit of hiding a burning cigarette in his mouth or behind his back during scenes. You could often see a thin plume of smoke rising from somewhere behind him. Benny Hill started slapping the top of his bald head, accelerated for comic effect, as a way to wave the smoke away. The audience never once knew it had begun as a backstage trick. Born John Wright on September 24, 1904, in Belfast, Ireland, the 8th of 12 children, he was 65 before he ever found his audience. He had crossed the Atlantic and back, working as a body assembler at Cadillac in the United States before the Great Depression sent him home. He drifted into television as an extra in his 60s until Benny Hill discovered him. At 4 feet 11 inches tall, Wright became, in Hill's own words, our little Donny Osmond. He died in a Belfast hospital on January 11, 1989, age 84. Little Jackie was the silent stooge everyone slapped. Jackie Wright was a man who waited until 65 to become famous and carried the secret of why a comedy legend kept slapping his head to the grave. Number 3 is Sue Upton, and the question her story answers is one almost nobody has thought to ask. When Benny Hill was found dead in his armchair in April of 1992, the man who broke down the door was his producer. But the first person that producer called after the police left was not a family member. It was Sue Upton. He called her before anyone else in the world. The reason why is one of the saddest secrets in British comedy. Here is the bond most viewers never knew about. Benny Hill never married. He had no children. He had no documented romantic partner of any kind. Then, in 1976, a 22-year-old dancer named Sue Upton auditioned at his Kensington flat, and from that day until the day he died, she was the closest thing to a daughter he ever had. Born on November 9, 1954, in Chadwell Heath, Essex, Upton had lost her own father when she was 3, raised by her mother alone. She joined his set in 1977 and stayed until the very last Thames episode in 1989, the longest-serving Hill's Angel by years. She married music executive Roger Watling and had 2 children with him. Benny was there for every step. He came to stay during school holidays, took her children to the circus and the Tower of London, telling her it gave him an excuse to do all the things a man his age could not do alone. After he died, the offers stopped overnight. As of today, Sue Upton is 71, still in Essex. A Hill's Angel was a pretty face in a feather costume. Sue Upton was the daughter Benny Hill never had, and the first phone call made when the world's most watched comedian was found dead alone. Before we go on, I want to ask you something. Which moment from the Benny Hill show has lived longest in your memory? The chase scene? The head slap? Ernie the Fastest Milkman? Or one of the saucy seaside sketches? Drop it in the comments. I read every single reply. Number 4 is Bob Todd, the lugubrious face supporting comic whose off-screen life is the most unlikely backstory of anyone who ever stood next to Benny Hill on camera. Watch him in any sketch and you see a slow, foolish, bumbling drunk. The real man was somehow all three of those things at once, and also a decorated wartime pilot who had survived crash landings most men do not walk away from. Here is the past nobody on that set ever talked about. Born Brian Jeffrey Todd on December 15, 1921, in Faversham, Kent, Bob Todd had originally trained to be a dentist. When the Second World War broke out, he abandoned that path and enlisted in the Royal Air Force as a bomber navigator, flying more than 800 combat hours over enemy territory. By his own account, he survived 5 separate crash landings. After the war, he tried cattle farming. The business nearly bankrupted him. At 42, broke and out of options, he wandered into a London pub, met 2 television scriptwriters, and simply lied to them, telling them he was already a working actor. They believed him. That single lie launched a 30-year career as one of British television's most loved stooges. On Benny Hill's set, he was famous for 2 things: his deadpan face and his drinking. He once disappeared after a London Palladium performance and woke up 5 days later in a Dublin hospital with no memory of how he'd gotten there. When Benny died on April 20, 1992, Bob Todd was too ill to attend the funeral and instead toasted him alone in a British pub. 6 months later, on October 21, 1992, Bob Todd was dead himself, age 70. The bumbling drunk in every sketch was Bob Todd at his most harmless. The real Bob Todd had survived 5 wartime crash landings, talked his way into acting on a lie, and died 6 months behind the only man he ever truly worked for. Number 5 is Louise English, the only Hill's Angel whose boyfriends had to pass a personal inspection by Benny Hill himself before she was allowed to keep dating them. He was not her father. He had no romantic interest in her. So why did the most famous comedian in Britain insist on vetting the love life of a teenage dancer? The answer reaches back 20 years before she was born. Here is the family secret most viewers never knew. Born on April 27, 1962, in Bow, London, Louise English came onto Hill's set at just 16 years old in 1978. Her mother, Elizabeth Liz English, had been a singer and dancer in a 1950s variety review called Evening Stars, touring across England alongside a young, struggling comedian named Benny Hill. The two had stayed close friends for over 20 years before Liz introduced her teenage daughter to him. Her father was a classical violinist with the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra. The boyfriend inspections were not jealousy. They were Benny stepping into the role of an uncle for his oldest friend's daughter, watching out for a 16-year-old in an industry he knew, better than anyone, was full of men who would not. She quickly outgrew the dance line and became the show's featured singer, performing classics like La Vie en Rose and Milord in flawless French. After the show ended, she carried that voice onto the West End stage and into films like The Wicked Lady with Faye Dunaway. As of today, Louise English is 63 and still working in London theatre. A Hill's Angel was a girl in a feathered costume. Louise English was the daughter of a Royal Philharmonic violinist and Benny Hill's oldest friend, and the only dancer on that set with a comedy legend personally vetting her boyfriends. If you're enjoying this, take a second to subscribe before we keep going. The 4 cast members ahead include a man whose father personally delivered Margaret Thatcher into the world, and a star whose final hours are one of the most haunting endings in British comedy. You will want to see how this ends. Number 6 is Nicholas Parsons, the elegant, deep-voiced straight man whose dignified bearing on Benny Hill's set always felt slightly too dignified for the chaos around him. There was a reason for that. He came from a world where the man who delivered his next-door neighbor's baby went on to deliver the future Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and his father was that man. Here is the piece of trivia almost no fan of the show has ever heard. Born Christopher Nicholas Parsons on October 10, 1923 in Grantham, Lincolnshire, Nicholas was the son of a country doctor whose patients included a local grocer's family by the name of Roberts. One of the babies that doctor delivered in that small Lincolnshire town was a girl named Margaret Roberts, who would grow up to become Margaret Thatcher, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. The straight man on a Benny Hill sketch had a father who quite literally brought the most powerful future leader Britain ever had into the world. From 1971 to 1983, Parsons hosted ITV's Sale of the Century, drawing audiences of up to 20 million. But it was on radio that he made his real history. He hosted BBC Radio 4's Just a Minute from its first broadcast in 1967 until 2018, 51 straight years, never missing a single episode until age finally caught up with him at 95. Nicholas Parsons died on January 28, 2020, age 96. The straight man in a saucy sketch was a small supporting figure. Nicholas Parsons was the son of the doctor who delivered Margaret Thatcher, and the man who hosted the same radio show for 51 straight years. A national treasure whose Benny Hill credit was the smallest thing about him. Number 7 is Jane Lee Wright, the only Hills angel who chose, deliberately, to disappear. Most of the women in the chase scenes faded into anonymous lives after the show ended. One of them did something stranger. She walked into the same industry that had made her famous, found a corner of it where the cameras never pointed, and built a second career so successful that her name now lives in the credits of hundreds of films and shows you have watched without ever once seeing her face. Here is the reinvention most viewers never knew about. Born on February 21, 1947, in London, Jane Lee Wright had trained as a serious ballerina with the Ballet Rambert and had toured the world with a French cabaret group before her teens were over. She first appeared on Benny Hill's Thames set in 1970 and stayed for 16 years. Benny himself coined her nickname on the show, the Sexiest Stooge. But somewhere in the middle of all those years, she made a quiet decision nobody around her saw coming. She began training in Foley artistry, the painstaking craft of creating live sound effects for film and television, footsteps in gravel, breaking glass, rustling clothes, all performed in a sound studio in perfect sync with the picture. By the time she walked away from acting, Jane Lee Wright had become one of the top Foley artists in Britain. As of today, she is 79. The sexiest stooge in a Benny Hill sketch was a young woman in a costume. Jane Lee Wright spent the second half of her life making sounds you have heard 1,000 times, in films you have loved, behind a name you have never once looked for. Number 8 is Henry McGee, the elegant straight man whose voice opened nearly every Thames-era episode with, "Yes, it's the Benny Hill Show!" That voice carried something most viewers never knew. A family line on the English stage stretching back nearly 200 years to a name once spoken in the same breath as David Garrick. Here is the bloodline most viewers never knew. Born Henry James Maris McGee on May 14, 1929, in South Kensington, London, McGee's mother's side of the family could trace its theatrical lineage all the way back to Catherine Kitty Clive, one of the most celebrated comedy actresses of the 18th century, the leading lady at Drury Lane opposite David Garrick himself. His father, a Rolls-Royce engineer, died when Henry was 17, ending his hopes of becoming a doctor and pushing him into the family business going back 2 centuries. He stayed with Benny Hill for 45 episodes across 20 years. He was the warm, motherly voice of the Sugar Puffs Honey Monster commercials throughout the 1970s. His final years brought Alzheimer's disease, and he died at age 76 on January 28, 2006, buried at Brompton Cemetery in London. The voice on the opening title card was just a working actor reading a line. Henry McGee was the great-great-great-nephew of one of the most celebrated actresses in English history, a man carrying 2 centuries of stage blood into a Saturday night sketch comedy. Number 9 is Benny Hill himself, the writer, the director, the star, the man who turned a saxophone and a sped-up chase into a global cultural phenomenon. And the saddest line in this entire video is the one I have to write next. After everything he gave the world, Benny Hill died alone in an armchair in front of a television set, and his body was not found for 2 full days. His story does not start there. Born Alfred Hawthorne Hill on January 21, 1924, in Southampton, England, he came from comedy blood. His father and grandfather had both once been circus clowns. At 17, in the summer of 1940, he sold his drum kit for £6, gave up his milkman job at Hans Dairy in Eastleigh, the job that would later inspire his #1 hit, Ernie, the fastest milkman in the West, and arrived at Waterloo Station in London with nothing but the names of 3 variety agents in his pocket. He changed his stage name in homage to his hero, Jack Benny. By 1969, his Thames show was on the air. By the early 1980s, it was watched in 140 countries. Here is what most viewers never knew about the man at the center of it all. Benny Hill never married. He had no children. He had no documented romantic partner. He lived alone in a shabby second-floor flat in Teddington for decades, despite being worth millions. In 1989, after 20 years of total dedication, Thames Television canceled his show, and by every account of those closest to him, the firing destroyed him. In February of 1992, he suffered a mild heart attack and was offered bypass surgery. He refused. A week later, his doctors found his kidneys were failing. On April 20, 1992, his closest friend, Dennis Kirkland, unable to reach him by phone for days, came to the Teddington flat. The police broke down the door. They found Benny Hill in his armchair, in front of the television, where he had been dead for 2 full days. He was 68 years old. His £7.5 million fortune went to 7 nieces and nephews he had barely spoken to in years. Sue Upton has said publicly that he wrote a second, informal will, leaving sums to her, Bob Todd, Louise English, Henry McGee, and Dennis Kirkland, the family he had actually built around himself. That second will was either never properly witnessed or was lost. None of them ever received a penny. Benny Hill is buried at Hollybrook Cemetery in Southampton, the city where he was born. Benny Hill on screen was a cheerful lecher chasing girls through a park, the most watched comedian on earth. Alfred Hawthorne Hill in real life was a quiet, lonely man who never let anyone close enough to share his money or his armchair, and who died exactly the way he had lived, alone in front of a television, surrounded by a fortune no one he loved would ever see. They made the world laugh in 140 countries for 20 years, and today the trail leads almost entirely into memory. Benny Hill rests at Hollybrook Cemetery in Southampton. Jackie Wright lies in Belfast, Bob Todd in Sussex, Henry McGee in Brompton Cemetery, Nicholas Parsons in Buckinghamshire. But Jane Leeves is 65 and still on screen in Los Angeles, the dancer who became Daphne. Sue Upton is 71 and still in Essex, the daughter Benny never had. Louise English is 63 and still on the London stage. And Jenny Lee Wright is 79, somewhere in Britain, making sound effects for films we have all watched without ever realizing her name was in the credits. 4 are still here, 3 of them women who walked onto that famous chase scene as scenery and walked off it as artists in their own right.